So our topic today is the Indo-Pacific and the Euroatlantic, same but different. And please allow me to introduce our three speakers. We have Ambassador Volker Stanzel, who is the Executive Board and Senior Distinguished Fellow at the German Institute for International and Security Affairs. He tweets at STVIL, so you're welcome to follow. Ambassador Stanzel is the former ambassador of the Federal Republic of Germany to Japan and China, and also a former political director at the ministry. We have Tomas Janeliūnas, who is a full professor at the Institute of International Relations and Political Science at the University of Vilnius. He tweets at Tomas Janeliūnas, and he has actually been doing his research at the university as a full professor since 2015 and lecturing since 2003. His PhD is in political science. Welcome, Tomas. And we also have Axel Nordenstam, who is an associate fellow at the Swedish Institute of International Affairs. His Twitter is at Axel Nordenstam. He's an associate fellow at the UI Asia program. He focuses on India, and I would especially like to bring to your attention that Axel in 2021 was listed as top 40 under 40 Europe-India leaders. So it's great to have him here with us. Axel is a PhD candidate in international relations. And my name is Aleksandra Bērziņa-Čerenkova. I will be your moderator today. I run the Asia program right here at the Latvian Institute of International Affairs. Now, during the iconic speech in 2007, Japan's Prime Minister Shinzo Abe, the speech Confluence of the Two Seas, the one that he made at the Parliament of the Republic of India, he said, by Japan and India coming together in this way, the broader Asia will evolve into an immense network spanning the entirety of the Pacific Ocean, incorporating the United States of America and Australia. Open and transparent, this network will allow people, goods, capital, and knowledge to flow freely. It's been 15 years. And perhaps this positive agenda is being outshadowed by one very strong word: security. The security agenda in the Indo-Pacific is becoming more and more pertinent. And that leads us to the inevitable comparison with the transatlantic. We also know that NATO has turned its gaze to the Indo-Pacific in its most recent documents, and also in the conversations that we've been having. So where do we stand today? What are the differences? What are the similarities? And what should we expect? Please allow me to give the floor first to Volker with the broader differences and similarities to set up the framework for today. The floor is yours, Ambassador.
Thank you, Una, and thanks to the Latvian Institute of International Affairs and to Friedrich Ebert Stiftung to have me to discuss with you an issue which is increasingly important to all of us, at the latest since this year, obviously, but as your quote from Prime Minister Abe showed, since a few years back already. Now, as you've said before we go into specificities, let me try to maybe compare the two regions in a broader sense, because I think 2 points are important. For one, there are similarities between the Indo-Pacific region and the Euroatlantic region, and there are differences. That's obvious. But I think that the main differences outweigh the similarities by far. So I'll mention a number of aspects that I mean in concrete terms. So one is that, of course, we're talking about China. Compared to the impact the appearance of a new superpower has on the region, everything else pales. And that is also, I think, the major reason for that move towards greater cohesion also in security affairs that you've been alluding to. Greater cohesion among at least some Indo-Pacific players. India, you mentioned it, Vietnam, definitely Australia, and Japan certainly. And the reasons that they want to create that greater cohesion or cohesiveness is a kind of what nowadays we like to call a new Cold War. Now, Cold War, obviously not between India and Japan or what, but we only talk about it when we talk about China and the United States. Now, the difference between the superpower of the old Cold War, that's the USSR, and China is that China is part of interconnected trading-founded regional exchange structures, which are profitable to all, China and the others, in various ways. Of course, the USSR also was involved in international economic exchange, from which it benefited, but it never became a driving force of connectivity, of the creation of supply chains, not to mention technological innovation in the way now China is doing that today. And then in the Euroatlantic region, we have the EU and we have the transatlantic relationship, which, however, is more part of the globalized international system, including the trading system, obviously. Compare that to the Indo-Pacific. Here, players in the region, I think, have experienced modernization-based economic growth, and they have thus come to build sub-regional networks, ASEAN, obviously, but also the CPTPP and the Regional Comprehensive Economic Partnership created by China, and a number of free trade agreements that China has initiated. Now, all of these constructs want and need that the interests be, let's say, integrated into the new multilateral security constructions, organizations, which in some ways, but by far not totally, parallel the economic organizations. That's AUKUS, that's the cooperation between Korea and Japan and the United States and others. And lastly, while we have conflicts between the countries of the Euroatlantic, I don't think we need to mention them. While we have those differences between some states involved in that new Indo-Pacific structures in governance, economic orientation, and the relationships to states and structures outside the region, foremost the US, but also European countries, EU countries, and the UK mainly. They cause frictions among them: Pakistan, India, Indonesia, Australia, Japan, Korea, North Korea, South Korea, North Korea. And to come to my second point, various factors are there which I think tend to make the situation volatile and also potentially dangerous. And these are that major players are at least partly involved in geostrategically oriented policies outside of the region. And these impact their policies inside the region. So Japan-Taiwan relationship, the Japan-Australia, Vietnam, India relationship, and I mentioned the India-Pakistan relationship. Next, China, that unpredictable, and some say, look at the new security strategy of Japan, maybe a dangerous superpower in the region. China has ambitions far beyond its regional interests. So competition with the US, dominance in Eurasia, what about Europe with the 16+1, and others. Now, almost unavoidably, other regional players whose ambitions are focused much more on the near neighborhood, that is the Indo-Pacific region, they may be drawn, I'm afraid, into conflicts that have actually nothing to do with their original interests. Only think about the most dangerous of such cases that we presently have on our plate, which is the Taiwan conflict. Now, lastly, players in the region do not constitute a homogeneous group. They're far from a situation like we have it in the EU. They also compete with each other, much more than is the case in Europe among European countries, or even between the US and Europe. That tends to make the situation significantly more dangerous than we would even dream of in the Euro-Atlantic region. And by that, I mean even armed conflicts between countries of the region cannot be excluded in the way we would exclude them in Europe, Ukraine notwithstanding. But I think we agree that this is a different and specific case. So, to come to my conclusion, while we see efforts toward greater cohesion in the Indo-Pacific, also in security aspects, mainly caused by the impact of China's role, while we see these efforts, we have to analyze the possibilities of greater cooperation from the perspective of taking into account the differences, which are important factors between that region and our own, the Euro-Atlantic. Thank you very much.
Thank you. And with that, let me please go to Axel to lead us into the discussion of the Indo-Pacific and maybe to take us on a journey regarding the broader thinking around EU's Indo-Pacific strategy. What is that? Why are we suddenly all adopting an Indo-Pacific mindset here in Europe?
Thank you very much for posing that question and also for inviting me to the panel. Great to be with you digitally. So let me put forward a proposition here, namely that the Indo-Pacific is no longer just a combination of the Indian Ocean and the Pacific, the Indo-Pacific, as the Japanese Prime Minister Abe called it back in 2007, as you started off the panel with. But nowadays it comes with a meaning, and that meaning, in my point of view, is comprised by three elements: the Indo-Pacific as a region, and the Indo-Pacific as a concept, and the Indo-Pacific as a debate. So let me elaborate and take you through this and my thinking about this. First of all, the Indo-Pacific captures a region. It's a term for a new geography, quite far away from Europe. There's no consensus among global actors about the scope of the region, but it's wider than the Asia-Pacific. Some view the Indo-Pacific as the new framing of the Asia-Pacific, but actually the number of countries that we include are different, and another difference is also that most people associate the Indo-Pacific as a maritime domain, as it's a matter of the oceans, whereas others actually also acknowledge that the Indo-Pacific deals with both maritime and land space. So it's not completely set here, but it's clearly a region. There we have consensus. But second, the Indo-Pacific as a concept. This concept captures the global power shifts that we're seeing from the West to the East. It's about the rise of Asia, the growing geopolitical importance of events quite far away from the West. But at the same time, the US and Europe have indeed high stakes here for our prosperity, for our security, that are highly linked to the developments in the Indo-Pacific, which Ambassador just alluded to as well. And here it's important to remember that the Indo-Pacific, the framing of the Indo-Pacific, really highlights India's position and importance to the region in another way than the Asia-Pacific used to do in the past. Third, the Indo-Pacific as a growing foreign policy debate among strategic thinkers. When I look at the debate, I see a growing strategic debate about the Indo-Pacific in various capitals, think tanks, universities all around the world, in which the idea of the Indo-Pacific is developed. And I think this is one of the reasons why a number of global actors are sharing their views on the Indo-Pacific and trying to shape what we really put into it. We have seen a number of strategies and guidelines published and visions by actors, ASEAN, Australia, Canada, just a couple of days ago. France, the European Union, India, Japan, the US. So there's clearly a foreign policy environment that actors cannot ignore. So this is what I mean with the Indo-Pacific as a region, as a concept, and a debate. So for the European Union, the response to this was actually quite member states driven. There was a group of EU member states that took the lead France was the first EU member states to publish an Indo-Pacific strategy, mostly with the argument that there was French territory in the region and thereby France was a residential power. But Germany quickly followed afterwards and published guidelines, put a bit of everything into this new framing of its Asia policy. And the Netherlands also followed on. So with this set of key EU member states, they took the lead towards also an EU strategy on the Indo-Pacific. So following council conclusions last year, the European Indo-Pacific strategy was released in September last year. And here I think there's clearly a China factor that influenced the debate. But this takes the form in different ways, because the title of the European Indo-Pacific strategy is very telling. It's not a strategy that is confronting China. It's actually called the EU Strategy for Cooperation in the Indo-Pacific. So one can say that the EU's approach here is a partnership approach. It's about building partnerships with partners in the region. When this strategy was published, there was a debate among European strategic thinkers and think tankers that really shaped this document. And some saw it as an opportunity to already increase the engagement in the region. The strategy would enable Europeans to diversify. Some argued. Others saw it as a necessity, that it was time for the European Union to wake up and actually talk contemporary foreign policy with our key Indo-Pacific partners, such as Japan, India, the US, and ASEAN. But there were also some skeptics saying that it's basically too extensive and too loose. And this fear about great power competition in the Indo-Pacific between the new two superpowers, the US and China, there was a widespread fear that great power competition would escalate in the region and would spill over to Europe. And that was the main reason why the EU strategy on the Indo-Pacific is partnership-driven rather than confrontational. But here it's also, of course, important to note that the EU's approach is highly positive to transatlantic cooperation, and European foreign policymakers that have been surveyed about the EU's Indo-Pacific strategy are also highly positive to cooperation with the US, Japan, India, Australia. So this is the broader thinking about the Indo-Pacific that we must take into account. And the question now is really for Europeans to focus on the implementation of the strategy, to put our money where our mouth is. And I think a wise way to do so would be to think about the Indo-Pacific as a region, but also as a concept and a debate that we engage in. Thank you very much.
Thank you. And now, from describing indeed in an excellent frame the Indo-Pacific mindset as a region concept, and I would say strategic narrative as at the basis of that, and a debate, let us move to the debate. Now we have an interesting case here of a transatlantic state, very transatlantically minded EU integrated member state that has become in a certain way a voice in the Indo-Pacific debate and has been looking towards a certain policy, or at least has increased its presence in the region. So let us please invite Tomas to comment on that. And that state, of course, is Lithuania, our southern neighbor. So the floor is yours, please.
Thank you, Una, and thank you for Latvian Institute of International Affairs for organizing this event. It's my great pleasure to join this discussion. So good afternoon, dear colleagues. Speaking about European perspective on Indo-Pacific region, I think China is indeed the most urgent issue the European Union has to decide on, to find a clear position how to deal with China. And I totally agree with Axel about this China's factor, which is driving the broader strategy towards the Indo-Pacific region. in the European Union, of course, there is a broad spectrum of different attitudes towards China and different perspectives on how to deal with China's economic and trade power. We have Germans whose Chancellor Scholz sees China's important trade partner. We have France, where Emmanuel Macron sees China as a potential threat, especially in the technology sector. We have Czechs who intensify bilateral relations with Taiwan, and so on. And here I would like shortly to explain the Lithuanian case, more specifically, Lithuania's drive to decouple from China. Lithuania, I think, is on the most radical side of the spectrum by choosing a posture of almost complete decoupling from China. And let me remind some basic facts. In the spring of 2021, Lithuanian government was the first which announced leaving the so-called 17+1 initiative. Just a few months later, Lithuanian parliament prohibited Chinese companies from developing a 5G network in Lithuania. And of course, the boldest move was made in November last year, when a representative office of Taiwan was opened in Vilnius. And the title of the office was chosen as Taiwanese Representative Office in Vilnius, instead of the more typical Taipei's representative office. And of course, this triggered a really harsh reactions from China. Beijing downgraded the status of its diplomatic representation in Lithuania. Lithuanian exports to China were almost completely blocked, with more than 90% of the usual flow of goods prevented from entering the Chinese market. However, what was the most worrying, Chinese companies threatened to block exports from other EU companies when they contain components of Lithuanian origin. So-called secondary sanctions were about to introduce on Lithuanian and European Union business. So while Lithuania took this quite radical position toward China, knowing about the most likely retaliation and what consequences this conflict produced. First of all, that's just explaining what the Lithuanian government was thinking about. The new government of Lithuania, formed back in 2020 from the Conservative Party and two smaller liberal parties, was clearly intended to choose so-called politics of values instead of pragmatic business-oriented interests. And decoupling from China, diversification of trade towards other countries in the Indo-Pacific region was declared as one of the priorities of Lithuanian foreign policy. Not the last argument was also an intention to support the United States in its increasing confrontation with China and to become a kind of, I would say, a flagship in this pro-American camp when it comes to opposing any kind of authoritarian regimes, be it Russia, Belarus, or China. And regarding the consequences, the most important result, in my opinion, is the elevation of debates inside the European Union on what to do with China. Due to Chinese intentions to go for secondary sanctions on Lithuania, the EU requested WTO dispute consultations in January this year. And later, Taiwan, Australia, Canada, Japan, the United Kingdom, and the United States also requested to join this WTA's consultations on this case. So the European Commission also was urged to move faster with so-called anti-coercion instrument that would allow the European Union to respond more effectively to economic sanctions on EU members, as Lithuania was the most recent example of such coercion by China. The European Parliament also has adopted several resolutions with very strong critics to China. And what was especially notable, the very first time, a special resolution on the relationship with Taiwan. In other words, I think Lithuania decoupling from China created a kind of new momentum in reshaping the EU relationship with China, or at least increasing the temperature and trying to fasten some decisions regarding what to do in China in the future. And the most important lesson was that China, despite all its efforts, was not able to change anything. Actually, Lithuania didn't change the title of Taiwanese representative office, opened its own trade office in Taipei just a month ago, reoriented trade from China to other countries of the region, especially placing emphasis on trade to some new markets like Australia, Malaysia, and some other, and even increased the volume of export this year. So, and remains one of the most vocal critics of China's Chinese authoritarian regime. So, I will stop maybe here, and I'm looking forward for continuing our discussion, but just wanted to stress that this case of Lithuania's, of course, is a good example how even a small state can contribute to much broader debate on the EU level, and even to initiate a kind of momentum in the broader strategies towards Indo-Pacific region and specifically towards China itself. So thank you.
Thank you. And Tomas's intervention got me thinking, because Volker, so this is going to be a question for you. You outlined splendidly that the differences outweigh the similarities, and yet here, being in Europe, we kind of have to keep both in mind. So there are two schools of thoughts, right? There are some who say that China is a regional challenge, so it is kind of an Indo-Pacific, or rather Asia-Pacific question, and China is only trying to, challenge the U.S. or the other way around, as long as it has to do with China's immediate vicinity, right? Then there's the other school of thought that says that China is a global challenge, or that it is the climate change of international politics, that it is a systemic issue that we will all have to face, no matter insert the name of the ocean here, right? So my question to you, given that given Tomas's intervention, is, where do you stand on this debate? Is China a regional or a global challenge? And is it a transatlantic issue as well then? We do not hear you yet?
You should hear me now.
And we hear you perfectly. Please.
Great. Now, there's a remark that Tomas made, which I think shows us an important similarity between the two regions, Indo-Pacific and Euroatlantic. And it shows us also that China is far from just a regional challenge, is much more concerning both countries in the Indo-Pacific and countries in the Euro-Atlantic region. And that is the remark Tomas made about the fact that when China imposed sanctions on exports from Lithuania, also companies in other European countries were affected if they used components produced in Lithuania. Now, this shows, I think, a much greater problem or phenomenon. While we usually say, well, Germany has this large trade exchange with China and it's the biggest partner of China in the EU, it makes us think or assume quite naturally that you have to see one European country beside the other and then compare their trade exchange or economic exchange with China. While reality is that companies in Europe are immensely interconnected and interrelated. And one product which Germany might export to China may contain components from Lithuania, from France, from Greece, wherever. And there is a large number, and I'm still struggling finding out that exact figure. There's a large number anyway of European countries that have enterprises that sort of piggyback on German companies, so that when you go to China, you find enterprises that German companies that produce, let's say Volkswagen, produce in China, but the components they use are exported from, let's say, Lithuania or from other countries into China to go into the cars which Volkswagen then produces. Now, obviously, we have this very similar situation in the Indo-Pacific, foremost with Japan, which plays a role which is very similar to the one that Germany plays in Europe. And secondly, with other countries, companies in the Indo-Pacific region, ASEAN, but also in India, I would guess, where they intertwine their production processes, so that in the end you have an end product which may go to China and be finally assembled in China, or go directly from, let's say, Thailand or India, so to other countries, but contains components from all across the region. So that, I think, is an enormous similarity. The way in which all the national economies of the countries of the two regions are actually focused towards China and thus become dependent on China. That is, I think, an enormous similarity. Not only that, it shows that the effect of whatever China does and decides is not just a regional phenomenon. It doesn't concern only the Indo-Pacific or only Europe. No, it contains much more. It contains at least those two regions, but as probably we should see, it also affects the relationship of China to the United States.
I bit my tongue when I was asking a question to you because I really wanted to stop myself from asking a Germany-related question. But thank you for taking it there anyway. It's like you read my mind. Now, ladies and gentlemen in the public, dear colleagues, I apologize that up to this point you have been just watching at me interacting with the screen. I'm very well aware that you are present, and we are looking forward to your questions as well in 15 minutes. So 15 minutes before the panel ends, we'll be taking your questions. So please do not leave me hanging here. I'm giving you a good time to think about some questions. Now, Axel, I think it was very interesting when you outlined this positive agenda points when it comes to this EU outlook on the Indo-Pacific, but I find one of your points I find particularly valuable is that you are saying that this is kind of, maybe I misread you, sorry for putting words in your mouth, you're welcome to correct me, but from what I understand is your argument is that the Indo-Pacific framework is kind of a source for dialogue with key partners across the globe rather than sort of a hub and spoke situation where we have the U.S. creating minilateral security, ad hoc groupings, perhaps somewhere coalitions of the willing or coalitions of the yeah okays. So I would like you to maybe to pull on that point a little bit. So this is almost like sometimes we look at it as a divisive and perhaps a problematic concept, but from what I understand your argument is that this is in fact a way for us to interact with partners in, with Japan, with Australia. So could you pull that thread a little bit? And of course, if you have any reactions to what the colleagues just said, you're welcome to disagree or agree, please.
Yeah, thank you very much. And actually, you understand me quite accurate in my point of view. The reason why I think about the Indo-Pacific in this way is also linked to how I see the broader Indo-Pacific debate among those really active in the region itself. I remember interacting with people in Delhi a couple of years ago, and I'm constantly in touch with think tankers across. And it strikes me that the Indo-Pacific has become a part of the foreign policy agenda in a way that it serves as a dialogue forum. Of course, you have all those trilaterals and issue-based coalitions that operate there in the broader framework. Quad is an excellent example of that, I think, but also those but also coalitions that are very much linked to specific issues, such as the Coalition for Disaster Resilient Infrastructure. So you have those on the one hand, but at the strategic level, when actors are planning for the future, when they are really thinking about what kind of decade are we about to have, then the Indo-Pacific keeps on popping up. It keeps on being this broader thinking that to me very much reminds me about my reading about Europe after the Second World War, when back then there was the question of like planning the continent, planning for peace, planning for connecting the region with other actors. And now what we are seeing since 15 years ago is this growing connectivity among actors in Asia and also among actors that want to engage in this environment, that really wants to be part of the Indo-Pacific future. So yes, I see it as a dialogue builder. And maybe to respond a little bit about to the example of Lithuania, because I think it's a really interesting case, and it also touches a little bit about how Lithuania responds to of course, China as a main factor. But I also see this as a broader trend in the EU-India track with the EU's relationship with India, because there Lithuania has sought closer ties with India. India opened up a new embassy or announced that it will open up a new embassy earlier this year. I'm not sure if it operates yet. But this comes, but the Lithuanian turn to India as a substitute or really follows the European trend that it's no longer just the largest member states across the European Union that see closer relationships with India, but it's actually a trend all across. And we have studied this at UI, and that paper is available online for anyone who wants to see how small and medium-sized member states engage with India. It's both bilateral and also through the EU level. And when we studied that, it's actually we found that it was more linked to the business opportunities in India and India's global weight as a global power than the China factor. But that study and the main analysis there is a year old now, and I think the China factor is stronger now than it was when we conducted that. So that's a quick reaction. Thanks.
A quick follow-up on this before we move to Tomas. But wouldn't you say it's also quite dangerous to perhaps oversell India as a substitute, or Taiwan for that matter? I think the business communities are a little bit weary of this, that we're sometimes, and then on top of that, just to play the devil's advocate here, India has a very quote unquote independent foreign policy, let's say, right? It's very pillar-based rather than aligned. So, and it's no secret that even among the other Quad partners, there's been some discussion on India's position regarding some of the issues. So, how do we work around that?
Yeah, that's the key question for everyone. How do you find this balance?
Probably you're asked this at every panel, and I apologize, but it's the token India question.
Absolutely. I think the main aspect here is to really understand and build capacity about India, build knowledge about what does Indian foreign policy actually imply, because it's sometimes more in line with the US than we might think, than we might expect. The US, after all, is India's main partner to combat, to actually secure itself. India is surrounded by two major enemies, and the main strategic challenge for India is China, just as it is for the US. And that is really worth keeping in mind when thinking about India. I quite often hear the business community's concerns when it comes to unpredictable environment in India. This is not just something that I hear from the business sector in one country across Europe, but also in different ones. It seems to have changed a little bit in the positive way in the last couple of years, but there's still a high degree of uncertainty, and the business sector is clearly not fully there in terms of leaving China and replacing India. I think the broader trend across Asia is rather that small and medium sized enterprises and also the larger companies are considering a number of different options when it comes to decrease their dependency on China, and also to overcome the over-dependency on China. It's about what the term is Vietnam, Thailand. Some considered India as well. But I think for the broader business community, what they are waiting for is the progress in the trade negotiations with India, where we've had 3 rounds this year, and there are some optimistic calls about that an FTA could be inked by the end of next year, but I'm not fully convinced that will be the case. I think it's going to be a long conversation.
Thank you. And as you may have noticed, this panel does not feature any future-related questions, so I'm not taking you there. I know how complicated it is for an analyst when you're asked a future-related question. Tomas, now, to go back to the Lithuanian example, I want to ask you, yes, of course, on the surface, we did see a lot of EU unity, but we do know that in some of the corridors within Brussels, there were voices raised regarding Lithuania's position, right? And so my question to you is, given that we are in Riga today, how do you assess the Baltic response? Did you expect something else? Do you think this is enough? And I of course mean the withdrawal, the halting the participation in China's cooperation format with Central and Eastern Europe during Nancy Pelosi's visit to Taiwan, but still talking about that. In the same statement, both Latvia and Estonia mentioned that they do not have any problem with bilateral cooperation with the People's Republic of China and with 27+1 EU-based common cooperation. How do you assess this position?
Well, regarding the common position of the Baltic states, I would say it was quite expected, looking from Vilnius perspective, that of course Estonia and Latvia would not follow by the same example as Lithuania did, but still the very tendency and the very direction is almost the same. As you said already, Estonia and Latvia also announced that they see no future, no rational cause to continue this initiative by China, 17+1. And by this, it's also both Latvia and Estonia show a kind of solidarity to Lithuania. But when it comes to the more broader solidarity on the EU level, of course, there was quite a different response from some capitals just trying to to raise questions. What Lithuanians you are doing? Why are you risking our relationship with China, and especially our trade relations with China? Because Lithuania was, in one sense, it was lucky having only a small fracture of export coming to China. It was less than 1% of total export which went to China just in 2021. So for Lithuania, it was quite easy to decouple from China in this respect. Some other countries in the European Union, of course, has no such privilege to be on such a hard conflict with China in economic terms. But when we speak about some political position, I also see some signs of solidarity coming from European institutions, especially from European Parliament. It is more brave by announcing more harsh critics toward China than, for example, European Commission, which has to make some compromises, which has to take into account very different positions from European Union countries. But still, even by this introducing on so-called anti-coercion instrument, which should allow to respond to such a kind of sanctions coming from third countries like China or Russia or whatever. So you are still making a step into towards direction of a common position, I would say. And this is, of course, a long way to go. And of course, to find a compromise, it's a very difficult job to do. But I get that European Union sooner or later will place itself on the side where Euroatlantic community should place, and it should side it with United States when it comes to a kind of response to authoritarian regimes, to a kind of response to neglecting rules of democracy, of free trade, and so on. So, in this sense, I think that European Union just started this path of finding a common position and common solidarity, but it sooner or later it will come to a common position.
Thank you. Now, ladies and gentlemen, as I promised, and also to our audience online, we welcome your questions. Please, sir. Let's start with you, then you, sir, and then you, sir. Please introduce yourself.
Māris Graudiņš, Progressive Party Foreign Policy Group in Latvia. My question is to Professor Janeliūnas. I commend Lithuania's admirable stand in terms of a principled foreign policy in the Taiwan Foreign Trade Office case. And you mentioned that it was a contribution to global debate by a small country, and I think this is, as I mentioned, admirable. But on the other hand, is it not also a contribution to a certain amount of chaos in European Union foreign policy? Wouldn't it have been better to consult in advance with centralized Brussels foreign policy institutions to have a united European Union response and policy in this case?
Excellent, thank you. I think this question is so punchy that Tomas should respond immediately before we move on to other topics. Please.
Yes. To be short, I'm personally was also in a position to criticize our governmental tactics about this decision. And as far as I know, there really was a lack of coordination before this decision. And I would say if more efforts would be given to at least in advance to speak with European Union representatives, and even with the Americans as well, there would be much more coherent response to this China challenge, I would say. So this was, in my personal opinion, it was really a tactical disadvantage for Lithuania not to speak enough to our partners in European Union, not to prepare them for such kind of escalation with China, and that costs even a popularity for our government as well domestically in Lithuania, because population, the society of Lithuania was also not ready for this kind of escalation. And some business companies which were trading with China was also not ready to this kind of challenge. So in this, with this regard, I would say the tactical approach was far from most optimal. And of course, I totally agree that this preparedness, the level of preparedness on the European Union level could be much better.
Thank you. So Lithuania adopted an act now and it's rather to ask for forgiveness rather than permission approach here, and we're very interested in seeing how that has played out. Please, sir, right there. Yes.
Thank you very much. I'm Yasushi Takase. I'm the ambassador of Japan here in Latvia. Well, thank you very much for very insightful opinions. My question goes to Ambassador Stanzel. Well, today you three had a very good discussion from a broader view. But how do you see the security issues? There are similarities or differences? Well, as you already mentioned, we are quite diversified in that sense, and it would be difficult to have a defense organization, single defense organization like NATO in Asia Pacific. But we are saying that the security issues in Europe and the security issues in the Indo-Pacific are not separable, because anywhere we should not admit any attempts to change the status quo by force, or any attempts to undermine the rule-based international order. So how do you see the security issues between Europe and in the Pacific?
Thank you. From one ambassador to another, please.
Yes, thank you. Before I reply to the ambassador's question, let me just make a remark on the Lithuanian question that was just discussed. I mean, the recklessness of Lithuania's decision made sure that it succeeded in its policies. Had it tried to coordinate its Taiwan policy with all the other member states, I think we can be sure the Lithuanian government would have been dissuaded from its intention on the naming of the representative office. And I must also admit, as a German here, that there are a number of other EU countries, including mine, who at times do not coordinate their policies among other member states, with other member states, also knowing that they would never get a consensus if they tried to achieve such coordinated policies. So I said recklessness, but I must say I'm full of understanding why at this time the Lithuanian government acted as it did. But to the other question, which is an extremely important one, dear colleague, I think, first of all, we have this tendency to talk about security, to take measures, create institutions, sort of institutions like the Quad or AUKUS in the Indo-Pacific region, because China is considered a threat. And in the security strategy paper that your government has just issued, China is not called a threat, but the way the formulation goes, it is quite clear that it is considered a potential threat. And if it wasn't, we would have none of the security discussions we presently have in the Indo-Pacific. But yes, you're right. The divergences, differences of opinion among the states in the region are still so great that it is impossible to imagine something like NATO in the Indo-Pacific region at this point in time. We might have one if we had a crisis, which we cannot hope for. If we had a conflict over, let's say, Taiwan, that's what everybody discusses now, I think we would have very soon much greater cohesion among the other countries in the region, aside from China, obviously. But that is something we cannot hope for. That is why I assume the discussion to which the Japanese security strategy is one contribution. And there are many others, and there have been many others, also from Australia, also from the United States, also from the other Asian countries of the region. It is, as I see it, an ongoing and progressing discussion with more and more countries trying to come to terms with what they consider as something akin to a threat emanating from China. obviously also here there are differences in the evaluation of what China does actually mean for the region. But I think we are in a phase of gradually coming together on an increasingly common position, which, to again mention former Prime Minister Abe that Uno introduced before, I think it was Prime Minister Abe who kicked off this process, very much in the spirit of the time at those days, and I think very successful if we consider what has been happening since. But it is a slow progress, still better than having a crisis which would force us to come together quicker.
Thank you. I hope it was to your satisfaction, Your Excellency. Please, sir.
Yeah, good afternoon. Johannes Wiedemann, NATO Strategic Communications Center of Excellence. I would like to ask Axel Nordenstam to comment on the following statement. So what connects Euroatlantic and Indo-Pacific? Yeah, look on the map, it's the Eurasian landmass. So what we see right now is another iteration of the old game that the West is well advised to prevent any single power dominating the Eurasian landmass. End of statement.
Please, Axel.
Yeah, thank you very much for that precise statement, allowing me to. We could happily talk about this later as well, but when it comes to the main aspects that connects the Euro-Atlantic and the Indo-Pacific is, of course, that both regions face global challenges. It faces security challenges that are both traditional and also non-traditional. We have talked a lot about the main common threat, that is China. But I think we should also address the non-traditional challenges that are facing the Euro-Atlantic community and the Indo-Pacific. And there we can talk a lot and collaborate going forward. Thanks.
Thank you. Now, I think this was a very interesting discussion from the perspective that we are all Europeans, and yet we somehow did cover both sides of the Eurasian landmass. And I think what has come out today from our speakers is that the new reality in the Indo-Pacific has made us rethink, or is making us rethink as Europeans, three aspects. First of all, we have to rethink economy, interdependence versus shockproofing. Another thing that came up was that we have to rethink security. Water-based naval logic comes in more and more. We also see China stocking up on that. And third of all, and perhaps that's the most worrisome for us Europeans, is that we have to rethink international norms because we might be experiencing a shift in the global order here. Now,
Thank you.